Why quiet people intimidate others. Psychological social tension. Quiet individuals are often perceived as intimidating, not because of aggression, but because silence disrupts predictable social interaction. Most communication depends on continuous verbal signaling. People unconsciously rely on these signals to evaluate intention, emotional state, and social alignment. When a person speaks less, available psychological information decreases. This creates interpretive uncertainty. In many social environments, uncertainty produces tension because the mind constantly attempts to predict behavior through observable cues. Silence interrupts this process. The quiet individual becomes more difficult to categorize, and this absence of clarity often produces discomfort in others. The intimidation associated with silence frequently begins at the level of perception rather than behavior. This becomes more significant in modern social environments built around constant expression. Chapter 2: The social dependence on constant expression. Modern social systems reward visibility and participation. Verbal expression functions as psychological reassurance because it provides predictable behavioral signals. Individuals who frequently explain themselves become easier to evaluate and socially position. Conversation therefore functions as more than communication. It also stabilizes social predictability. Through repeated self-disclosure, individuals reduce uncertainty and reinforce familiarity. Openness gradually becomes associated with trustworthiness because it increases informational transparency. Quiet individuals interrupt this structure. Their reduced participation limits external confirmation and weakens the normal rhythm of reciprocal interaction. As a result, other individuals often struggle to interpret intention, confidence, or emotional position. This lack of immediate clarity can generate unease, particularly in environments where constant responsiveness is socially expected. The important detail appears here. Silence does not merely reduce communication. It reduces psychological certainty. Chapter 3: Why silence creates psychological projection. Human cognition attempts to resolve informational gaps through interpretation. When external information becomes limited, the mind compensates by constructing assumptions. This mechanism becomes significantly more active during interactions with quiet individuals. Silence creates ambiguity. Ambiguity increases projection. The observer begins attributing characteristics to the silent person without sufficient evidence. Competence, judgment, superiority, emotional distance. These characteristics are often psychologically projected onto individuals who reveal little about themselves. The intimidation is therefore frequently generated internally by the observer rather than externally by the quiet individual. The silent person becomes psychologically undefined, and undefined personalities often appear more psychologically significant than clearly expressed ones. The less information available, the greater the interpretive activity surrounding that individual. This is where Carl Jung's analysis becomes relevant. Chapter 4: Carl Jung and the unobserved person. Analytical Jung argued that social interaction is mediated through the persona. The persona functions as a structured identity designed for external adaptation and predictability. It allows individuals to communicate socially recognizable versions of themselves in order to stabilize interaction. Quiet individuals often reveal less of this constructed social identity. Their internal position remains less externally organized. As a result, they become more difficult to interpret through ordinary social categories. This produces what Jung described as symbolic uncertainty. According to Jungian analysis, the unconscious mind reacts strongly to what remains partially concealed. Personalities that resist immediate interpretation often become psychologically amplified because the observer unconsciously attempts to complete what remains undefined. The quiet individual therefore acquires disproportionate psychological presence, not necessarily through action, but through reduced external exposure. This creates another psychological effect. Restraint itself begins to appear significant. Chapter 5: The psychological power of restraint. Restrained behavior is frequently associated with self-control. Individuals who react minimally or speak selectively appear less governed by immediate impulse. In social environments, this can unconsciously influence perceptions of authority and psychological stability. Predictable behavior reduces tension because it becomes easier to anticipate. Constant emotional or verbal expression makes an individual more psychologically transparent. Quiet individuals often maintain greater informational control because they reveal fewer internal reactions. This restraint alters social perception. Others may interpret limited reaction as confidence, emotional regulation, or hidden competence. Whether accurate or not, the appearance of control affects how social hierarchy is unconsciously evaluated. In many situations, intimidation emerges from the assumption that the quiet person possesses greater internal stability than the surrounding environment. The contradiction becomes more visible during direct interaction. Chapter 6: The conflict between expression and observation. Most social interaction depends on reciprocal disclosure. Individuals typically exchange information continuously in order to maintain psychological balance during conversation. When this exchange becomes uneven, tension often develops. A person who speaks extensively while another primarily observes creates an asymmetrical interaction structure. The speaking individual gradually becomes more psychologically exposed, while the observer remains comparatively undefined. This imbalance increases self-consciousness. The observer appears psychologically distant because their internal position remains unclear. Silence in this context is often interpreted as analysis, evaluation, or concealed judgment. The discomfort produced by quiet individuals frequently results from this imbalance between exposure and observation, rather than from any explicit behavior. This explains why silence is so frequently misinterpreted. Chapter 7: Misinterpretation and social anxiety. Silence is commonly misinterpreted because ambiguity activates existing insecurities within the observer. Individuals experiencing social uncertainty often attempt to explain unclear behavior through internally generated assumptions. As a result, quietness may be interpreted as arrogance, criticism, emotional coldness, or superiority, despite the absence of supporting evidence. The observer transforms uncertainty into perceived social threat. Social anxiety intensifies this process because anxious cognition tends to overanalyze limited information. The less expressive the quiet individual becomes, the more interpretive pressure is transferred onto the observer. In many cases, the intimidation associated with quiet people reflects the psychological condition of the surrounding environment rather than the intentions of the silent individual themselves. The final implication is important. Silence reveals how strongly perception depends on interpretation. Chapter 8: Final psychological reflection. Quit people intimidate others because silence disrupts predictable psychological interaction. Most social systems depend on constant signaling, emotional transparency, and reciprocal reassurance in order to maintain interpretive stability. When these signals are reduced, the observer compensates through projection, assumption, and self-analysis. The quiet individual becomes psychologically amplified because their internal position remains partially undefined from a Jungian perspective. The reaction to silence reveals the extent to which human perception depends on interpretive completion. The intimidation associated with quiet individuals often originates less from what is expressed and more from what remains psychologically unresolved within the observer. The question is not whether quiet people are intimidating. The deeper question is why uncertainty alters human perception so strongly. Subscribe for more psychological documentaries and analytical philosophy. Comments for next.